Hello, and welcome to Immigrant Magazine Weekly on TIMTV, where we share the immigrant perspective on breaking news and stories of importance to the growth of our communities. And the best in all things immigrant. First of its kind, I might add. For those of you who haven't subscribed yet, now would be a good time to click on the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Also, make sure you press the like button so that YouTube will share our videos. I'd like to welcome David Monda, Professor of Political Science, American Government and International Affairs at City University of New York, York College. His doctoral training is situated at the intersection of comparative politics and international relations with an emphasis on migration policy. His research interests center on transnational migrant communities, securitization of narratives around terrorism, and comparative electoral politics. This research has included fieldwork and research in Belize, South Africa, Brazil, Kenya, and Argentina. Just the right person to have this conversation with. I want to welcome you, Professor Monda, to our Immigrant Magazine Weekly. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much.
It's been a long time coming, and I think this was the best time, and you're the right person to have this discussion with. You know.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I must say, I am honored to be on your show for the first time, speaking about immigrant stories and also speaking around this really fascinating time of elections. Yes. And what immigrants can do. We have Kamala Harris, who's just been nominated, who is the daughter of immigrants, talking about the immigrant story, and a woman at that, and a woman of color. So this is going to be a very exciting session. I'm very excited. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome, and this is the first of many because, as we said in our introduction, you're a professor of political science, and deal with migrant issues and so much more. So let's get to it. But before we actually talk about the topic on the agenda, I want you to tell our audience a little bit about your ethnic origins so that they get perspective.
Okay, so sure. So I'm from Kenya. My name is David Monda. I teach political science at the City University of New York at York College in Queens. And Monda, my last name, means man of wealth.
Wow.
But I'm still working on the wealth part at this point. I'm originally from the western part of Kenya, and I was born in Nairobi, Kenya. I emigrated to the US to complete my graduate studies, and that was in 1997. I've since become a US citizen. And so this is why this particular topic is really important to me, because I've been through the immigrant process. I've been through the immigration process, which is extremely difficult. I empathize with a lot of immigrant communities and some of the challenges of the structures of immigration that create very unequal dynamics. And I'm also very passionate, not only in terms of my academic work, what I teach and what I research, but about a community engagement. Here in New York, where I'm based, I'm very active with the Kenyan and African community, trying to bring people together. Right now, we're really trying to think about how we can have community advocacy around basic issues of COVID. As you understand, New York is the state that's had about about 30% of all the deaths of COVID in the whole United States. So we've been disproportionately affected. And this, as you can imagine, has directly affected our immigrant communities. Because for a lot of them, because of the immigration status, they're afraid of showing up to seek medical help. Yeah. They've lost employment. A lot of them cannot get into formal employment because they don't have the papers and documentation. So I think in a roundabout way, from my background, being an immigrant in this country, my whole immigrant story, I think really situates me in a really interesting space to be able to think about some of the dynamics that are going on in the political season at this time.
Wonderful. And you know what, you spoke about wealth and you said you're working on it. I don't think, depends on how you define wealth. I think you're wealthy.
Thank you.
So let's talk about this historical moment with Senator Kamala Harris. nominee for vice president, if all goes well. She'll be the first South Asian and Black
Yes.
and female
Yes. Yes.
in that vice president of the United States. And
Yes.
potentially, you never know, she might end up being the president someday. She might run, who knows? But
This
that's
is true.
really, it's something else. So what are your thoughts about this appointment?
I think this appointment provides a lot of exciting opportunities, but it also creates a lot of challenges. And let me start with a lot of the opportunities. For one, we have a second chance when a woman is either at the top of the presidential ticket, as happened with Hillary Clinton in 2016, or is close to the top of the presidential ticket. In other words, they're part of the joint ticket. In this case, you have a candidate for vice president in Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. And this creates a lot of opportunities in a whole range of issues, right? Women's voices are now being heard, voices of immigrants and minorities, the immigrant story will be heard. I think should the Biden-Kamala Harris team win, there'll be a lot of healing they'll have to do to try and bring people together, because the current administration has perfected the art of division and of creating these cleavages between and within communities. However, on the other hand, we cannot write off Donald Trump and the Republican campaign machinery. That's exactly what happened in 2016. Nobody thought Trump would win the presidency. When he said he was running at the initial stages, nobody even thought he'd get the nomination by the Republican Party. And today in 2020, we know the reality. So my point is, the other side, the Trump administration is really trying to frame this message, one, around the fact that you have a woman in the vice presidential ticket raising doubt about her capacity to lead. Secondly, there's this nativist narrative. And by that, I mean this idea of who exactly is an American. And there's this narrative this message being created around Kamala Harris that she's really not American. She really is not born in this country. Very similar game that was trying to be played with Barack Obama. But then the third issue also is in relation to the Democratic Party. This is a big challenge because we know we had a very divisive nomination process. Kamala Harris said a lot of negative and hurtful things about Joe Biden, some of them true, some not true. For example, how he treated women, allegations of sexism, some of the negative things Joe Biden had said about immigrants. So this is really a party, the Democratic side, in division. And the two of them really need to work out the ticket so they can bring a lot of healing. There's a lot of discontent within the party about Bernie Sanders not being the nominee, because a lot of people in the party felt that he would actually do something with universal health care that would actually affect the lives of immigrants, provide health care for everybody. There's a section of the party that were the Sanders supporters that see Biden as part of the old school, as a continuation of the old establishment. So that's one other area where, in terms of a challenge, in terms of this joint ticket of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, they really need to bring the party together. So be watchful of the attacks from the Republicans, but also be watchful about bringing the Democratic Party together.
Spoken like a true political scientist. You summed it all. You summed it all up. But speaking about what happened to Barack Obama,
yes,
Fatherism, which you've alluded to, and what Kamala Harris is going, in addition to the sexism that is also attached, calling men angry or presuming that men would be angry or are angry. Are you angry?
I'm not angry, but I know there's a constituency in this country that's very angry.
Really?
For example, yes, if you think about places in Appalachia, in West Virginia, places in upstate Pennsylvania, right? A lot of the Midwest that has suffered for many years with a lot of their jobs being exported to East Asia. People who used to, 50 years ago, a father could hand over a job at General Motors in Michigan or Pennsylvania or West Virginia to their son or their child in a factory, and you could earn a very good living. You didn't have to work 2-3 jobs. Now those jobs are not there anymore. A lot of these white working class people still have high school diplomas, and they're finding the realities of America with all the immigration, with people of color advancing, getting more educated, it becomes very, very difficult for them. So there's this nostalgia and challenge that now you have a woman of color on the ticket. Now you've already had a Black president. It seems that other racial groups are moving ahead. And there's a section of white America, a section of this working class, poor working class that's really struggling. And I think those are really Trump's core supporters. And those are the people that will actively come out to vote for him. So it'll be a really interesting dynamic in terms of, as much as Kamala Harris is an opportunity for a lot of people, but in other parts of this country, in other states, she's looked at as a threat, as a threat to the status quo, to this broad narrative of white privilege and of America as it used to be. The country is moving forward very quickly, but a lot of groups are being left behind. So we can think of immigrant groups, we can think of the 12 million undocumented immigrants of this country, but also the working poor, whether those be people of color, but also the working class, the white working class. The candidate really needs to speak to that the Democratic Party or Republican Party or whoever else is running on the ticket to think about, how do we provide an inclusive umbrella so that whoever's president works for everybody. Everybody benefits, whether you're white, poor, working class, whether you're highly educated, whether you're an immigrant without papers, that everybody's interests are being catered for. And I think that's the delicate balance here.
You know what? When you were talking about this whole narrative about the nativism and, who would be angry, I was really not thinking in those terms. I thought this was also a sexist, racist overtone that has been put in to serve a purpose, of course. So now let me ask you about the African immigrant participation in this. What difference do you think the African immigrants can make to this dialogue and the outcome of these elections? Because this is a crucial time for immigrants in general, regardless of political party.
I think they can make a big influence. I think one of the areas I would think about is for those immigrants who are green card holders, who are permanent residents, for them to immediately get their citizenship. Because as a permanent resident, if you don't have papers, you can't vote. Or if you try to vote, that's illegal. That's a felony. So get your citizenship if you're a green card holder, if you're an African immigrant, if you're an African immigrant, regularize your papers, get your citizenship, register to vote, and actually show up to vote. Follow the voting procedures. A lot of us will have to vote by mail this time around because of COVID. So that'll be another dynamic to think about. The other aspect is, even if you cannot vote, if you're not a citizen or you can't process your papers fast enough to get citizenship, volunteer, get involved in your community in terms of creating this awareness, attending town hall meetings, writing to representatives. There's a lot of work you can do around the election infrastructure, around getting people out to vote. And I say this, Pam, particularly in relation to women, because historically in this country, and in many parts of the world, around the world, women don't support women candidates. And I think this is a very critical element. Part of the key constituency for Kamala Harris to be successful will be those suburban white women that need to come out to vote, because women of color generally always vote Democratic. But there's a lot of suburban white women, and this happened with Hillary Clinton, who did not turn out and who didn't vote, who didn't support Hillary Clinton for a range of individual personal issues. But I think that's a very critical dynamic. And for the immigrant, even if you can't vote or whether you can vote, getting involved in this story, speaking to people, volunteering, and being able to have these constituencies to come out to vote, I think will be super, super important for this election.
You know what? I can't for the life of me imagine that any woman will sit this one out, regardless of political affiliation. If you look at the children in cages, we look at the sexism, the pretty much disrespect of women and communities of color, especially the systemic racism that's plaguing the country, and women bear these children. I mean, mothers of Black boys, Black men, I imagine that they would be canvassing out there for everyone to go to turn out in their large numbers to vote. So hopefully African immigrants can take heed and not slip up, because a lot of the time they are working so hard and all they're interested in is putting food on the table. But right now with this coronavirus, I think that there's been an awakening, wouldn't you say?
I definitely would say that. A lot of our African immigrant populations live in the major cities, for example, New York or California, which usually vote Democratic anyway. Though that's not a disincentive to turn up to vote. You need to vote anyway. But I think the critical areas will be those populations, and we have significant African immigrant communities in those swing states, the perennial swing states. Cities like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, cities like Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, cities like Michigan, Ann Arbor, Chicago, Illinois, Madison, Wisconsin. We don't have huge numbers of Africans there, but if the African communities there are organized and actually show up, those few votes can really tilt an election. This happened with Hillary Clinton in 3 states. She didn't lose the election by a huge margin. She actually won the election if you consider the popular vote. She got more popular votes than Donald Trump. The problem with her was she lost 3 critical states by very small margins. So when we're thinking about this election debate and strategy, it'll be really critical for the Democratic side to think about what are those key states and how do we get these immigrant communities to vote? Not necessarily those huge metropoles like New York and LA where immigrants who can vote come out to vote, but in places like Columbus, Ohio, which is another critical swing state, places like Cleveland, Ohio, places like Wisconsin, a lot of those Midwestern states, Iowa, Arizona. Yeah. Iowa, Arizona have traditionally been Republican states. Right now, because of COVID, they're swinging. It's possible there'll be, they could be Democratic states. So immigrants really need to be conscious of this, and wherever they are, they really need to show up to vote. It's not enough just to talk about it and to follow the news. You have to be engaged. You have to register to vote, and you have to turn that ballot in.
Tell them what's at stake.
I tell them what's at stake is the future of the United States. Right. And not only the future of the United States, what this election translates to is economic opportunity for everybody, the broadening of the pie, growth of this American pie in terms of fundamental change to universal healthcare. I keep going back to that about healthcare should be a human right. And there's thousands of families in this country where people are going into bankruptcy, taking huge debt just because a loved one needs an operation or they need surgery. And in the richest country in the world, it's really unfortunate that we have to get to this situation. This is a referendum on the Trump administration. How it is that a country with 4% of the population, the United States, has had over 50% of the deaths in relation to this COVID. It's embarrassing. We are number 1 in terms of the deaths related to COVID. This is unacceptable. Thirdly, when we think about the African continent, we want an administration and individuals that have foreign policy experience and are sensitive to the needs of the African continent. We've had major problems, for example, in Cameroon, with a lot of the abuses of human rights. We have currently problems in Zimbabwe with very autocratic rule and an economy on decline. We have problems in Libya. We have major issues in South Sudan. And I think someone like Joe Biden really provides a lot of this amazing foreign policy experience, right? That he brings to the table. So there's also another angle of the African diaspora and the African continent and how important it is that we need to have a paradigm shift. Business cannot continue as usual. Africa cannot continue to be marginalized. These dictators who've been in power for so many years, something needs to be done about this because the problems on the African continent end up being American problems. We cannot ignore human rights abuses in Cameroon, in South Sudan, in Zimbabwe. They directly affect the United States. We cannot turn a blind eye to public health care collapses on the African continent. 3 years ago, remember, Pam, we were talking about Ebola and the SARS virus. And Ebola, which was transmitted from Liberia and Sierra Leone, some of the immigrants ended up unknowingly getting infected, and it really created huge problems in places like Dallas.
Yeah.
So the world's a global village. And with this election, the American election affects the African continent. The American election affects the fate of African immigrants and immigrants broadly in the United States. And then lastly, I also think the fate of this election in relation to healthcare and foreign policy, but also in terms of immigration reform, Pam. And I know this is an area that you've worked on for many, many, many years. We really need to figure out a space where 12 million people that are here that are undocumented, something needs to be done about this. And in particular, those innocents, the children who are brought here not of their will, and they don't have their parents because some of their parents are deported. They don't have a genuine means of pursuing an education because the DREAM Act, DACA, is still up in the air. We're not quite sure if it's still gonna be here 10 years from now. So this is a critical election in just so many of those different areas that I've mentioned.
You know, we can't even exhaust it in this time that we have, but you brought at the top of the conversation, you mentioned the divisiveness and the issues that the party has had, and all those historical things that have happened, and we live in a cancel culture. What would you say to the Sanders, for example, faction supporters who sat out the last elections because they were not happy with the choice representing them? What would you tell them today if they repeat that same mistake?
Well, I would tell them this is a democracy, and in a democracy you have free will, exactly. Right? I cannot force them to show up to vote, right? But somebody really needs to think about 2016 and think about what happened then, right? And then think about a very basic question. Is the country better off in 2020 than it was in 2016? Good. And obviously, we know the answer to that. It's in a horrible position. So if you sat out in 2016, if you sit out in 2020, it's likely that the country in 4 years' time is going to be in even worse shape based on what's happened in the past 4 years. So they really need to come out and vote, and they really need to think more pragmatically about this question, because it's better, you can institute more reform within the Democratic Party by supporting someone who you agree with on most issues, on 80% of the issues, than on someone who disagrees with you on 100% of the issues. Right. It's easier to work with someone who you can at least agree with on 80% of the issues. So I'd encourage them to understand that they're hurting, that Bernie Sanders didn't win, but Bernie Sanders himself has said that he would like to support the current ticket. And I think they should take inspiration from that and work within the party on those core areas that they're concerned about: healthcare, immigration reform, and these critical foreign policy issues around human rights and the abuse of people around the developing world, and particularly among immigrant communities abroad.
Well said. On another note, on a cultural and social impact note, what do you think Kamala, being the product of Jamaican and Indian or South Asian parents, brings in terms of helping with the diversity that, you know, we've experienced and continue to experience now at that top level?
So I think, again, here, that's a bit of it's a rose. There's beautiful parts of it, but there's also some very dangerous parts. And part of the beautiful parts of the ticket is that she retells the immigrant story, which is this idea of America as a land of opportunity, right? That you can make it no matter what your race, your background, your gender. If you come here, you do an honest day's work, you're committed to your family, your faith, and you have your goals set up, you can succeed, right? But again, even within our minority populations, I've been hearing these ramblings of divisions between the Indian population and the Black population. Mm-hmm. Right? And it's difficult to find out, and I think this is one of the challenges for Kamala and for the Biden ticket. How do you motivate, for example, African Americans to come out to vote for Kamala Harris? This was a problem for Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. because there's no African American on the ticket. This was a problem with Hillary Clinton. Part of the reason she lost was there was that enthusiasm gap between the Obama and Hillary Clinton. When Obama was running in 2008 and 2012, the African American community was so energized. The Latino community was very energized. But when Hillary came onto the ticket, there was that drop off in terms of enthusiasm of Latinos and particularly African Americans showing up to vote. I think that is a major challenge for the Biden camp. How do they energize and make African Americans and Latinos excited about this election? And then the other element we should be careful about is also the issue of voter suppression in key states like Florida, key states like Michigan, key states like Wisconsin, because a lot of state voting laws are actually going against the 14th Amendment, right? The selective incorporation and the equal protection. So a lot of states are passing laws that are disenfranchising minority populations. So the Biden Kamala ticket should be really careful to ensure that they have legal representation at polling stations. If they need to sue to have those polling stations open later for a variety of reasons, people can't vote. There'll obviously be major legal issues with the voting by mail. So they need to be ready for voter suppression in terms of that, because currently what the administration is doing is it's defunding our postal service. And if you really think about it, that's a direct form of voter suppression.
And that is
so that is a major issue, because if people don't have access to a post office, that means you're finding a way not to allow them to vote. And this is a major challenge in terms of minority populations and allowing these people to vote. So it's going to be a very interesting election season.
Very interesting and great conversation. And we'll have to continue this conversation on the next edition of Immigrant Magazine Weekly. So thank you so much, David, for this amazing political perspective from the immigrant voice.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me.
You're welcome. And see you next time.
All right, thank you. Bye.
We've come to the end of our show. I hope you enjoyed it. And if so, please share your opinions with me in the comment section or send me an email at publisher@immigrantmagazine.com. I hope that you will subscribe and invite others to subscribe to this new and revolutionary channel, TIMTV, Voice of Immigrants in America. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram @Anchang and like us on Facebook, The Immigrant Magazine. See you next time on Immigrant Magazine Weekly.